Welcome to the short introductory series introducing the Aramaic language. Maybe you've heard about the Aramaic language as the language of Jesus, or you've heard about it in a movie before. Passion of the Christ is the big one. There's a number of others where it's mentioned. Maybe you haven't heard about it. What is Aramaic? And can we ask this question, is it a theological language? The simple answer is yes, no, and yes. So I'm going to start with the first yes. Is it a theological language? Maybe I can pose it this way. It's certainly a religious language. Again, why do we know about it? We know about it through religious context. It's a language important to both Jews and Christians. In Judaism, it's the language of Talmud. It's also part of the Hebrew Bible. More importantly, in Daniel and Ezra, there are portions that are actually written in Aramaic, and that's called biblical Aramaic. And in fact, most Aramaic that people study is biblical Aramaic. The next most important, call it dialect of Aramaic, is Syriac. Syriac is a language that existed in late antiquity and into the medieval period. And of course, it sort of, at least in its literary form, looks to be non-operational after the Middle Ages, where people start speaking Arabic more commonly, or they transition to, and maybe transition is the wrong word, but they continue speaking in local dialects. And those dialects may actually predate some of the literary traditions of Syriac. So Syriac's important to Christian history because a lot of the literature that is written in the Christian East is in Syriac Aramaic, right? So it's important to both Judaism and Christianity. If you look at the vast corpus of Aramaic, most of it is going to be Jewish and Christian. It's going to be from these traditions. And so the things that we read, whether they're, Talmud or the Targums or biblical Aramaic or the Pshita Syriac Bible or the Syriac Fathers, Ephraim, Yaakov, Narsai, etc. There's Philoxenos, there's a number of them. There's so many. It's just a very rich language in terms of Judaism and Christianity. So most of the things we have in Aramaic are tied to religion somehow. But now the first no, it's a language. People speak languages. When people want to communicate, they choose a language to communicate in. Does that mean the language is fundamentally theological? Not necessarily, just because the things that survive tend to be religious. If you look at the most ancient Aramaic stuff, it does have religious elements to it. The inscriptions will evoke gods and curses and things, but this is in a we could call it cultic or religious context in the ancient Near East. So they're languages of operation. They're royal inscriptions. There's all sorts of different funerary inscriptions. There are caches of documents that are letters and correspondences that are in Aramaic. Beyond that, even if you're reading Syriac literature written by Christians, and keep in mind, right, like what happens with Aramaic over the years is that it goes from being a language of a mobile people in the ancient Near East that is adopted by empires, first the Assyrian and then the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And from that, there's an apparatus or there's an institution that drives the spoken and written language. Again, we're only going to collect what's written, right? Like we're not hearing people speak these days. We have a good idea, what it sounded like, but we don't hear them speak. So all we have is what's written, and there's a force driving it. So in the Christian era, there's no longer an empire that is driving Aramaic use. Instead, it's the church. And even in the church's use of classical Syriac, there's a number of things that are not even, they're not necessarily religious. There's chronographies. There's many histories that are written. There's books of philosophy that have been translated from Greek into Syriac that are later translated into Arabic. And so you have works that aren't necessarily religious. So again, language is something people use to communicate. It doesn't mean that just because a corpus is one thing or another, that the language is fundamentally one thing or another. I mean, we can think of Arabic, for example, right? Arabic, is it an artistic language? I would say it is, both through its poetry and through the constraints of iconoclasm. You get art forms that actually utilize the text of Arabic to produce, magnificent works of art. Is it? Well, you can turn on the TV. I mean, if you have access, and the internet, you can see anything these days. But you can watch Arabic movies. You can watch Arabic news programs. You can go to different countries and speak Arabic to people. And maybe none of the context is religious at all, or artistic for that matter at all. So is it an artistic language? And we can say the same for Greek. Is Greek a philosophical language? Maybe it is. Maybe the way it developed, the way that terms were coined and developed was a result of philosophical thinking. And so now they have a set of vocabulary that's very rich and sophisticated and proper to certain types of conversations, philosophical conversations. So now let's go ahead and ask the final question. Is it a theological language? And the answer, I would say, is yes. And it's outside of the first yes and no. The reason why Aramaic is a theological language is because of the way that Semitic languages in general operate. And part of this we could apply to Hebrew and maybe by extension Arabic. I think Hebrew may be a little more the case, just because some things happened by the time of the classical era that, or late antiquity really, that sort of shift the way the languages, the Semitic languages operate. And because of that, there's a movement in a different direction, verbally, grammatically. I won't go into too much detail on that, but I think the older you get, sort of the more mysterious language is, because language is reflecting what people know about the world. And so older languages tend to have a certain mystery to them. Now, within the Semitic languages, and someone recently asked, well, how do I know what a Semitic language is? Basically, common word structures, common grammar points, typically proximity geographically, but that isn't always the case. So look at Indo-European. It goes from India to Europe, right? Like this very wide stretch of the earth. Semitic languages are kind of confined to the Middle East and then Ethiopic Africa. So when we look at the Semitic root system and the way it manifests in Aramaic, we talk about roots, and people may think, well, what are you talking about? Every language, every word has roots. The way Semitic languages work is they typically work off of this triradical root system. In other words, three letters tend to, it's not always three, right? But they tend to form the basis of nouns and verbs. How reality is articulated is through the system that connects word. By the time English is developed, we have several different roots and influences pushing into the language where, maybe we'll choose different roots or ways of explaining things. We like things like word choice and variants. In the Middle East, there's this idea of word play, right? Where, certain things that we read in translation, they've lost their gravity from the original language, okay? That's certainly the case with Aramaic. And I think this applies to Hebrew too, and by extension, Arabic, but Aramaic especially because it has not only a reflection of the ancient words, the ancient terms, and how different ideas connect through these common roots. And really, the way you connect a word, right, to another word, we may not do that in English or any other language. But the way that these words connect, it makes you think, right? It sort of reframes your approach to reality, because the people in this time and place, they're living in a hyper-spiritual context. And being in a hyper-spiritual context, the language naturally reflects that way of thinking, okay? So just a couple examples. Some of these are examples you would find in Hebrew, let's say, like the word ruach or ruho in Aramaic, ruach in Hebrew. This means spirit, breath, or wind, right? Spirit, breath, or wind. Think of that. Your spirit, right? This force in you, you know about it through breath. You feel it in the wind. You know it's there. You know it exists, but you can't grasp it, right? You can't hold it. You can encounter and experience it. And when a person no longer aspirates, see, we kind of do it in Latin, aspirare, right? Like we have this root that gives us words like spirit, aspirate, and things like that. That's kind of how the Semitic languages work. You've got these ideas connected that maybe we wouldn't connect in English. We won't connect, wind or breath with spirit. That works for both Aramaic and Hebrew. One thing that works for Aramaic, and there's a lot of these examples, is the idea of love, right? Herbo. So herbo as love goes back to the root beth, right? What is that sound? It's the sound of fire igniting. Because how can you describe love? Like, what's the way that we describe love, right? And it's that love that, is like a fire that kindles. It's something that burns hot and it comes from out of nowhere, right? Like, so the idea of love and a fire igniting, not just fire, right? But fire igniting is really interesting in Aramaic. There's a plenitude of examples that we can talk about in terms of the way that Aramaic works as a language that is theological, right? Because of its worldview. And when we connect ideas like this, we can see how the people who wrote scriptural or religious texts had a certain mind about them. It's because their language reflected the way they perceived reality, right? So is Aramaic a theological language? Yes, no, and yes. So take that idea with you in your studies. And if you're not studying Aramaic at the moment, maybe it's something to think about for the future, or at least to read about, right? Like if you're not going to sit down and maybe take a course or something, get some books, read about the language, read about the authors or people who produce texts in the language and kind of the way they think and perceive reality.